Officer Marcus Brandt, a white cop in Carverton, slaps Dr. Aisha Coleman, a black woman in a pristine blazer, during a late-night traffic stop on a deserted downtown street, her luxury SUV gleaming under flickering lamps. He smirks, expecting her to crumble, but her icy stare unnerves him as a bystander's phone flashes. Then she whispers, "You'll regret this," and his gut twists. Little does he know, this split-second act ignites a firestorm that'll torch his career, his life, and everything he believes about power in this city. What's her next move? Before we dive in, where are you watching from? If you stand for justice, kicking back at arrogance, hit like and subscribe, because tomorrow's special episode is one you won't want to miss. Marcus Brandt gripped the steering wheel of his beat-up cruiser, the engine humming low as he tore down Carverton's silent downtown streets, the flickering lamps casting jagged pools of light across the cracked asphalt. His knuckles whitened, still buzzing from the sting of his open palm cracking across Dr. Aisha Coleman's face, a black woman who dared to step out of her sleek luxury SUV with a spine too straight for his liking. That slap had felt good, righteous even, a quick lesson for her type rolling through his turf. Carverton's gentrified, white enclave where he'd spent 10 years keeping the lines clear. Her pristine blazer, her polished shoes, her steady hands passing over that license, it all screamed money, confidence, things he figured didn't belong on someone like her in a place like this. Not at 2 in the morning, not on his watch. He'd pulled her over 10 minutes ago, clocking that shiny black sedan gliding past the boutique storefronts and overpriced cafes, a car too nice for this hour, too nice for the profile he'd built in his head. Suspicious, he'd told himself, flicking on the siren, though deep down it was her posture that set him off, the way she'd climbed out without a tremble, no hint of the deference he'd squeezed out of dozens of others with a glare or a shove. Black drivers didn't get to glide through here, not without his say, not without shrinking under his stare. She'd handed over her license, her fingers steady, her voice smooth as glass when she asked, "What's the reason for this stop, officer?" No shake, no bow, just those dark eyes locking onto his like she had the right to question him. That's when the heat had flared up his neck, the itch to put her in her place, to remind her who ran these streets. "You don't ask me questions," he'd barked, snatching the card, her name blurring in his squint, Dr. Aisha Coleman, some fancy title he didn't care to clock. "Open the trunk, now." She tilted her head, calm as a statue, and said, "I'd like to know why." That did it. Her defiance, her refusal to grovel, it gnawed at him, a challenge to the order he'd enforced night after night, the one that kept Carverton Heights clean, kept people like her on the other side of the tracks where they belonged. He'd stepped closer, towering over her 5'6" frame, his 6'2" bulk casting a shadow across her face, and when she didn't flinch, didn't drop her gaze, he'd swung. The slap landed hard, a sharp clap that bounced off the empty storefronts, her cheek blooming red under the streetlight, and he'd smirked, waiting for the tears, the cowering he'd seen 100 times before. But she didn't break, didn't even blink, just stood there, her stillness a wall he couldn't punch through, her eyes slicing into him like she saw past the badge, past the gun, into the rot he kept buried. His smirk faltered, just for a second, a flicker of unease he shook off as some punk with a phone stepped out from the shadows, red dot blinking, filming the whole damn thing. Marcus didn't care. Let them record. It'd be another blip, another nothing that had faded by morning. He'd yanked her wrists behind her back, the cold steel cuffs snapping tight, biting into her skin until faint red lines welled up against her dark complexion. She didn't cry out, didn't fight, just exhaled a soft breath so controlled it twisted his stomach, a sound that mocked his force without a word. "Resisting arrest," he growled, loud enough for the camera, his voice rough with the authority. He'd wielded 1,000 times, figuring it'd paint her as the problem. The criminal, not him, not the cop doing his job in a city that never blinked at a little roughing up. He shoved her toward the cruiser, the dented door creaking as he swung it open. Ignoring the punk's murmurs, the flash of that phone multiplying as another shadow joined, then another. 3, maybe 4 bystanders now, their whispers turning to shouts, but he brushed it off. They'd tire out, post their little clips, move on. Same as always. Carverton didn't care about one more stop gone sideways, not in a place where the news shrugged at worse. He pushed her into the back seat, her frame sliding in with a grace that grated on him, like she was stepping into a boardroom, not a cage. The door slammed shut, the thud echoing down the block, a punctuation mark on his control, or so he told himself. Circling to the driver's side, he slid in, adjusting the rearview mirror out of habit, ready to peel out and leave the gawkers behind. But then he caught her reflection, those eyes again, steady, unyielding, staring straight ahead, not at the floor, not at her cuffed hands, but through the glass, through him. A calm so deep it felt like a threat, and his fingers fumbled on the keys. A split-second stutter he covered with a cough. She was nobody, he told himself, just playing tough, waiting for her one call to some slick lawyer who'd bluster and fold. The engine roared to life and he gunned it, tires screeching as he tore away from the curb, the shouts fading into a dull hum, replaced by the crackle of the radio spitting routine calls, lulling him back into the rhythm of a night he thought he owned. 15 minutes later he rolled into the precinct lot, a squat brick bunker bathed in flickering sodium light, the air thick with exhaust and damp concrete. He hauled her out, gripping her elbow tighter than he needed to, dragging her up the chipped steps, her heels clicking with a precision that irritated him, a sound too sharp, too composed for someone in cuffs. Through the double doors he shoved her into the lobby, expecting the usual chaos, desk sergeants barking, phones ringing, drunks slumped in chairs. But the room went quiet, a hush so sudden it prickled his skin, every head snapping up, pens stalling over forms, coffee cups freezing, mid-sip. A dozen pairs of eyes pinned him, wide, unblinking, like he'd walked in with a ghost trailing behind him. He smirked, figuring it was just the cuffs, another perp in tow, nothing new. "Process her," he barked at the rookie behind the intake. Desk, a kid with a patchy beard and a nervous twitch shoving Aisha forward. Resisting disorderly the works. His voice bounced off the walls, filling the silence with his version of the truth, the one he'd spin to keep this clean. But the rookie didn't move, just stared, mouth half open, clipboard trembling in his hands. Marcus frowned, unease flickering again, sharper this time. Her silence louder than the room's, her posture unbroken, shoulders square, head high, not a speck of defeat in her. "What's the hold-up, Jensen?" he snapped, stepping closer. Towering over the kid, expecting him to jump. Jensen swallowed hard, shaking his head slow like he was waking from a daze. "That's Dr. Coleman," he muttered, voice barely a whisper, eyes darting between Marcus and the woman in cuffs. Marcus's smirk twitched, the name meaning nothing to him. Some activist, maybe, a local loudmouth he'd never bothered to track. He shrugged it off. Just another bleeding heart. Nothing he couldn't handle with a night in lockup and a fat fine she'd never pay off. But the air shifted, a chill creeping up his spine as an older cop coughed, shifting in his seat, avoiding Marcus's glare while a third slipped out the back, phone to his ear, fingers trembling as he dialed. The precinct buzzed with a tension he couldn't place, a static that gnawed at his gut. He shook it off, chalking it up to adrenaline, the slap still buzzing in his veins. "Book her," he growled again, louder, shoving her toward the desk, figuring he'd shut them up, keep the night his. But the crowd outside swelled, their murmurs turning to shouts, a chorus of voices spilling through the precinct's cracked windows. He glanced out, saw phones flashing, red dots multiplying like fireflies, the clip already spreading, racking up views faster than he could count. 10,000, maybe more, in hours. He smirked again, thinner this time, telling himself it'd fade, just noise, nothing Carverton hadn't swallowed before. But Jensen's whisper hung in the air. Dr. Coleman. And Marcus's chest tightened, a flicker of doubt he couldn't shake. What the hell had he just stepped into? Marcus Brandt stood in the Carverton precinct lobby, the stale air thick with cigarette smoke and the tang of spilled coffee, his boots planted firm on the chipped linoleum as he shoved Dr. Aisha Coleman toward the intake desk. Her wrists, still, locked in his cuffs, bore faint red welts from where the steel had bitten into her dark skin, a mark he'd etched with a twist of satisfaction just 20 minutes ago on that deserted downtown street. The slap still echoed in his ears, a crisp, satisfying crack that had sent her head snapping sideways, her cheek flaring red under the flickering lamps. He'd expected her to crumple, to shrink like every other black driver he'd stopped in Carverton Heights over the past decade. But she just stood there, her icy stare cutting through him, her pristine blazer untouched by the scuffle. That defiance, that refusal to bend, had fueled his growl of resisting arrest as he dragged her here, figuring he'd bury her in paperwork and walk away clean. The precinct buzzed with its usual late-night hum, phones trilling, a drunk muttering, in the corner. But the second he pushed her forward, that hum died. Every eye in the room swiveled to him, pens hovering over forms, a sergeant's coffee cup stalling mid-sip, the rookie Jensen's clipboard trembling in his grip. Marcus smirked, thin and tight, assuming it was just the sight of another perp in tow, a routine he'd run 1,000 times. "Book her!" he snapped, his voice bouncing off the concrete walls, rough with the authority he'd built over 10 years patrolling these streets. Resisting, disorderly, throw in whatever sticks. He shoved Aisha again, her heels clicking. Sharp against the floor, her posture still infuriatingly straight, shoulders square, head high, not a speck of defeat in her frame. He figured the crew would nod, back him up, same as always when he brought in someone who didn't know their place. But no one moved. Jensen's mouth hung half open, his patchy beard twitching as he stared at Aisha, not Marcus, like she was the one holding the gun. The older cop by the coffee machine coughed, eyes darting to the floor, while another slipped out the back, phone pressed to his ear, fingers shaking as he dialed. Marcus's gut twisted, a flicker of unease he couldn't place, her silence louder than the room's, a weight pressing against his chest. "What's the damn hold-up?" he barked, stepping closer to Jensen, towering over the kid, expecting him to jump like he always did. But Jensen just shook his head, slow, dazed, muttering, "That's Dr. Coleman," like it was a prayer or a curse. Marcus's smirk twitched, the name still a blank in his head, some uppity type he'd never bothered to clock. He opened his mouth to snap again, to demand they process her, when the double doors banged open, a gust of damp night air flooding in behind Captain Elena Torres. Her broad frame cut through the frozen crowd, her boots stomping the linoleum, her face drained of color, but her eyes wild with a fury Marcus hadn't seen in his 5 years under her. She zeroed in on Aisha, then Marcus, and before he could blink, she was on him, her voice cracking like a whip. "You idiot, she's the chief of police!" The words hit like a sucker punch, air rushing out of his lungs, his knees locking as the room spun. "Chief of police, Dr. Aisha Coleman?" His world tilted, the floor shifting under his boots. This black woman, the one he'd pegged as a nobody, some lawyer or activist he could shove into a cell and forget, was Carverton's top cop. The one who signed his checks, who ran the whole damn department? No, that couldn't be right. Not in this city where he'd thrived on keeping people like her in check, where his badge had always been enough to silence questions. He'd seen the chief's name in memos, heard it in briefings, but never pictured this, never imagined. A black woman in a luxury SUV could hold that kind of power. His mind scrambled, grasping for footing, and he forced a laugh, brittle and sharp, spilling out before he could stop it. "Self-defense," he spat, squaring his shoulders, planting his boots firm. "She resisted, provoked me. You've got my back, right, Torres?" The laugh died in his throat as Torres's eyes narrowed, a vein pulsing in her temple. She stepped closer, close enough for him to smell the coffee on her breath, her hands trembling with something he couldn't name. Not yet. "Uncuff her." "Brant, now," she growled, her tone a blade that sliced through his bravado. He bristled, jaw tightening. Because no, this was his collar, his call. He'd felt her defiance, her challenge when she'd questioned his stop, and he wasn't about to let some desk jockey undo it, not over a woman he'd already put in her place, or so he thought. "She's a nobody," he shot back, doubling. Down, his voice rising to fill the silence. "Resisted me, assaulted an officer. You want to explain that to the brass?" The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that prickled his skin, but he didn't flinch. He turned to the gaggle of officers, their faces a mix of shock and fear, and barked, "She provoked me. You all saw it, right?" No one nodded. No one backed him. They just shifted, feet scuffing the floor, eyes dropping, a few slipping phones from pockets, thumbs tapping screens. The faint ping of notifications started, a chorus growing louder, sharper, and Jensen muttered, "It's online, man, the slap, it's everywhere." Marcus's stomach lurched, his smirk faltering, because he'd figured the bystander's clip would fade, just another blip in Carverton's endless noise. But now the precinct's walls seemed to close in, the air thickening with a weight he couldn't shake. Torres shoved her phone in his face, scrolling fast, her jaw dropping as the clip played. 30 seconds of his hand cracking across Aisha's face, her head snapping sideways, then righting itself, unshaken, the crowd's gasps, a soundtrack to his unraveling. "You're done," Torres hissed, her voice tight with fury. "Suspended, effective now." She yanked a suspension order from her pocket, the paper crinkling as she slapped it against his chest, her knuckles white around the pen she'd used to sign it. Marcus's head spun, because suspensions took days, red tape he could worm through. Not this, not a guillotine dropping in minutes. He squared his jaw, forcing that smirk back, because this was temporary, had to be. He'd weathered worse, talked his way out of tighter spots, and no way some woman, even the chief, could undo him this fast. Aisha stood steps away, wrists still, cuffed, the steel glinting under the fluorescent lights. Torres grabbed the keys from Jensen, who fumbled them under her glare, and unlocked the cuffs herself, the metal clattering to the floor. Aisha flexed her hands, the red lines fading slowly, her cheek still marked by his slap, a stark bloom against her dark skin. But her posture was iron, her suit unwrinkled, and when she spoke her voice was soft, deliberate, a chill threading through every syllable. "You've started something you can't stop, Officer Brandt." It wasn't anger, wasn't gloating, but a quiet certainty that sank into his bones, making his smirk twitch, though he hid it with a scoff, rolling his eyes. "Yeah, we'll see," he muttered, because he'd play the game, ride out the storm, let the brass cool off, and be back on the streets in a week, badge gleaming like always. But the precinct windows rattled, a roar swelling outside, protesters, spilling onto the lot, their chants punching through the glass. "Justice for Aisha! Justice for Aisha!" Phones flashed, a sea of red dots, the clip looping on every screen in Carverton, his slap echoing louder with every view. He glanced out, saw signs bobbing, faces twisted with rage, and his chest tightened. Torres barked at him to get out, her voice a shove, and he stormed through the lobby, shoving past wide-eyed cops, their silence a wall he couldn't breach. The chants followed him, a rhythm he couldn't mute, and he realized too late the crowd wasn't bluffing. The phones weren't. Just noise. This wasn't just a bad night. What had he unleashed by raising his hand? Want to weigh in? Comment number 1 if you think Marcus's arrogance deserves this smackdown, or if you reckon he's got a shot to squirm out. Hit like if Aisha's. IC Comeback has you rooting for her to crush him, and subscribe to catch every twist this firestorm's about to ignite. Can Marcus spin this suspension into a win, or is Aisha's next move already tightening the noose? Stick around to see how this chief turns his world upside down. Marcus Brandt stormed out of the Carverton precinct, the night air slapping his face with a damp chill. As he shoved past the double doors, Captain Torres's suspension order still crumpled in his fist. The chants of "Justice for Aisha" roared. Behind him, a swelling tide of protesters clogging the lot, their signs bobbing like jagged teeth under the sodium lights. He didn't look back, didn't give them the satisfaction, his boots pounding the asphalt as he beelined for his truck. A rusted pickup parked crooked in the corner. The slap he'd landed on Dr. Aisha Coleman, Carverton's chief of police, still buzzed in his palm, a righteous sting he clung to despite the chaos it had sparked. Suspension? Fine. He'd ride it out, same as he'd done with every complaint, in his 10 years on the force. This was just noise, a storm that had blow over once the brass cooled off and the crowd found something else to scream about. He floored it out of the lot, tires screeching, the precinct shrinking in his rear view. As he tore through Carverton's gentrified streets, past the boutique storefronts and overpriced cafes he'd spent a decade keeping clean. His duplex in Carverton Heights loomed ahead, a squat 2-story box with peeling paint and a sagging porch, a fortress he'd carved out in this white enclave where people like Aisha didn't belong, not in his world. He slammed the truck door, stomped up the steps and locked himself inside, the deadbolt clicking with a finality that steadied his pulse. The TV flickered on, a reflex to drown out the echo of her voice, that soft, chilling, "You've started something you can't stop," she'd whispered as Torres uncuffed her. He snorted, flipping to a news channel, expecting the usual late-night filler, maybe a car chase or a bar fight. But there she was. Dr. Aisha Coleman filled the screen, her midnight blue suit crisp against the backdrop of Carverton's City Hall, her dark eyes steady, unyielding, the same ones he'd met with his slap. Her cheek bore no mark now. The red bloom faded, but her presence cut deeper than any bruise. "We're launching a full probe into Officer Marcus Brandt's 10-year record," she said, her voice a blade of calm slicing through the static. "No one is above accountability." The words sank into his gut, heavy and cold, but he forced a smirk, leaning back on his lumpy couch, the springs groaning under his 6'2" frame. A probe? Let her dig. He'd buried his tracks, greased the right palms, kept his rough nights quiet. She'd find nothing, and he'd be back on the beat in a week, badge gleaming, laughing about this with the guys. The smirk held until the window exploded. Glass sprayed across the living room, shards glittering on the worn carpet, as a brick thudded to a stop near his boots. He jumped, heart slamming against his ribs, the TV's hum drowned by the crash. Scrawled in jagged red ink across the bricks. Rough face were 2 words: racist pig. His breath caught, the air thickening with a sudden sharp panic he hadn't felt since his rookie days. He snatched the brick, fingers trembling, and peered through the shattered pane. Shadows shifted beyond his porch, a handful of figures scattering into the dark, their footsteps fading down the street. The protesters had found him. How the hell did they know where he lived? He grabbed his phone, thumbing through contacts, dialing his crew, the ones who'd traded beers over stories of keeping Carverton Heights in line. First call straight to voicemail. Second, a dead ring. Third, nothing. Silence from every name he'd counted on. Guys who'd nodded at his stops, laughed off the complaints, backed him when the heat got close. Now they were ghosts, leaving. Him alone with the brick's weight in his hand, the TV looping Aisha's presser, her voice a relentless drone promising justice he couldn't outrun. He scrolled online, the clip of his slap now a wildfire, racking up 1 million views, comments scrolling too fast to read. "Racist cop. Fire him. Jail's too good." His address popped up in a thread, an anonymous tip pinned to the top, and his stomach lurched. Someone had sold him out. The first rock hit the front door, a dull thunk that jolted him to his feet. Then another cracking against the siding, followed by a bottle shattering on the porch. He bolted to the window, peering through the blinds, and saw them, a mob swelling. In the street, 20, maybe 30 strong, their faces twisted with rage, phones flashing, signs swinging. "Justice for Aisha! Brandt must pay!" The chants punched through the walls, a rhythm that shook the duplex's flimsy frame. He grabbed a chair, wedging it under the doorknob, his pulse hammering as more rocks rained down, pinging off the truck, denting the hood. A brick sailed through the kitchen window, smashing a cabinet, and he ducked, glass crunching under his boots. This was his space, his sanctuary, and they were tearing it apart piece by piece, all because of her, because he'd raised his hand to a black woman he'd pegged as nothing. He yanked the curtains shut, barricaded the door with a bookshelf, his breath ragged as the mob's roar grew louder, closer, fists pounding the siding, a bottle torching the mailbox with a whoosh of flame. He thought about his gun, locked in the precinct safe, useless now, and cursed under his breath. They'd tire out, he told himself, sweat beading on his brow as he paced the shrinking room. They always did. These things faded, burned out, left. Him standing. The pounding slowed, the shouts dulled, and he peeked out, saw the street emptying, the mob dispersing into the night, leaving a trail of broken glass and charred wood. His chest loosened, a shaky grin tugging his lips. He'd survived. They'd thrown their fit, and he was still here, still whole. Let Aisha dig her probe. Let the crowd scream. He'd outlast them all. He sank onto the couch, the TV still blaring. Her face, her promise of accountability looping like a taunt. The brick sat heavy in his lap. Racist pig, staring up at him, but he tossed it aside, forcing that grin wider. He'd call in favors tomorrow, lean on the guys who'd ghosted. Him tonight, get this squared away. The clip would die down, the views would plateau and Carverton would forget. Same as it always had when he'd bent the rules. He grabbed a beer from the fridge, the cold can steadying his shaking hands, and took a long swig, the bitter taste. Grounding him. He'd won this round, kept his ground, kept his house. The storm was over, or so he believed, sinking back into the cushions, the tension bleeding out of his shoulders. Then his phone buzzed, a sharp jolt that cut through the quiet. He fished it from his pocket, expecting a buddy finally checking, in a lifeline from the crew he'd built. But the screen glowed with a text, no name, no number he knew, just 6 words that froze the beer in his throat. Your past is next. His grin vanished, his pulse spiking as the room spun, the brick's weight sinking back in, the chants echoing in his skull. Who'd sent it? How'd they get his number? The TV flickered, Aisha's eyes locking onto his through the glass, and he realized this wasn't the end, not even close. The slap hadn't just sparked a protest, hadn't just cost him a night. It had opened a door he couldn't shut, a reckoning he couldn't see coming, and whatever she had planned, it was clawing closer, sharper, deadlier than the mob's rocks. He stumbled to the window, peering into the dark, the street empty now, but heavy with a silence that pressed against his chest. The text glowed in his hand, a promise he couldn't shake, and he scrolled the news again, catching a headline. Chief Coleman vows deep investigation. His gut twisted, the beer slipping. From his grip splashing across the carpet. He'd thought he was safe, thought he'd held the line, but the mob was just the start, the brick just a warning. What the hell was she digging up? What past was she dragging into the light? He locked the door again. The deadbolts click, a hollow comfort, because deep down he knew Aisha wasn't done, and whatever came next would hit harder than anything he'd faced tonight. Marcus Brandt slumped on his sagging couch, the Carverton Heights duplex a fortress of shadows, the shattered window letting in a damp breeze that stirred the glass shards littering his carpet. The brick with racist pig scrawled in red ink sat discarded by his boots, a taunt he couldn't shake since the mob had torn through his street hours ago. The TV flickered, Dr. Aisha Coleman's press conference looping, her voice a steady drumbeat promising a probe into his 10-year record, her midnight blue suit a stark contrast to the chaos she'd sparked. That slap he'd landed on her cheek, the one that had bloomed red under downtown's flickering lamps, still buzzed in his palm. A fleeting triumph now souring into a nightmare. Suspension was one thing, but that text, your past is next, glowed on his phone. A splinter he couldn't pull out. He'd ride it out, he told himself, cracking open another beer, the cold metal slick against his calloused fingers. He'd buried his dirt deep, greased enough palms to keep it quiet. Let her dig. She'd find nothing. The clock ticked past 3. In the morning, the chants of justice for Aisha faded to a dull echo in his skull, the mob long dispersed. He needed his gear, his spare badge, something to feel normal, to remind him he was still a cop, still in control. He grabbed his keys, slipped out the back, and drove through Carverton's empty streets, the gentrified enclave silent under a day, moonless sky. The precinct loomed ahead, a squat brick bunker bathed in sodium light, its lot deserted save for a stray cat slinking past the dumpster. He parked in the shadows, hood up, and crept inside through a side door, the familiar stink of bleach and sweat hitting him as he moved past the holding cells, their steel bars glinting in the dim glow. His locker was in the basement, a rusted box he'd stuffed with backup uniforms, a spare holster, a photo of him grinning at the academy 10 years back. He'd grab it, lie low, wait for the storm to pass. He'd barely turned the corner when headlights flared through the basement windows, slicing the dark with red and blue strobes. Engines growled, doors slammed, and internal affairs suits swarmed the lot, cheap jackets flapping as they boxed his truck with unmarked vans. Marcus froze, his pulse spiking, keys slipping in his sweaty grip. They poured through the precinct's back entrance, flashlight beams cutting the gloom, gloved hands clutching a warrant that fluttered in the lead agent's fist. "Brandt!" A wiry guy with a buzz cut barked, spotting him by the lockers. "Step out now!" His voice was clipped, no room for argument, and Marcus's gut twisted, his legs shaky as he raised his hands, playing dumb. "What's this about?" he rasped, forcing a grin. But the agent shoved the warrant in his face, the paper crisp with ink still wet from a judge's signature. They tore into his locker, crowbars prying the metal apart, spilling his gear across the concrete. Uniforms crumpled, the holster clattered, the photo fluttered down, his younger self staring up with a smirk he didn't recognize anymore. The agent flipped through files, bagging a yellowed report Marcus hadn't seen in years, a 2018 case he'd buried deep. A black teen, 17, jaw busted, eyes swollen shut. A beating he'd dealt out in a Carverton Heights alley for loitering, pinned on a junkie with a bribe and a threat. The kid's name, Jamal Tate, scrawled in faded ink, stared back. At him, a ghost he'd forgotten until now. The agent grinned, a sharp, gleeful edge to it, holding the report like a trophy. "Chief Coleman's team dug this up, Brant. You're cooked." The words punched through Marcus's skull, a sledgehammer to glass, shattering the lie he'd built that his past was untouchable. He stumbled back, leaning on a wall, the cold concrete biting his palms as they bagged more evidence, photos of bloodied knuckles, a dashcam clip he'd scrubbed from the system, all clawing their way back into the light. "That's nothing," he spat, his voice rough with a defiance he didn't feel. "Old news, you've got no case." But the agent's grin widened, and Marcus's chest tightened, the air rushing out of him. He'd been careful, hadn't. He kept his tracks clean or clean enough, paid off the right guys to lose the right files. But Aisha had found it, her reach deeper than he'd dreamed, her power cracking open his past like a fault line. The suits hauled off boxes, their taillights, fading into the night, leaving him alone in the basement. The precinct's glow mocking him, a place he'd ruled now a tomb. He slipped out, heart slamming, and floored it back to the duplex, the streets blurring past as his mind raced. He could bribe his way out, call in favors, lean on the crew who'd ghosted him last night. He snatched his phone, thumbing through contacts, dialing numbers he'd burned into memory. First call, voicemail. Second, a dead ring. Third, silence. His buddies, the ones who'd laughed off his rough stops, traded beers over stories of keeping the streets clean, were gone. Their absence a wall he couldn't breach. He scrolled the news, hands shaking, and saw it. Protesters downtown, a crowd of hundreds burning his effigy, a crude dummy in a cop uniform swinging from a lamppost, flames licking its legs. "Brant must fall," their signs screamed, phones flashing. The clip of his slap now 1,000,000 views strong, a wildfire he couldn't douse. He sank onto the couch, the cushions swallowing him, the TV flickering to Aisha's face again, her probe announcement looping, her eyes boring into him. Through the screen, the brick sat heavy by his feet, the text, "Your past is next," a noose tightening around his neck. He'd thought he could wait it out, thought the mob was the worst of it, but this raid, this report, it was her turning his own system against him, weaponizing the machine he'd bent for years. The teen's face, Jamal's, flashed in his mind, those swollen eyes, that busted jaw, a kid he'd left bleeding in the dirt because he'd dared to walk through his neighborhood. He'd laughed it off then, a quick flex of power, but now it was back, sharper, uglier. A parade of pain he'd dismissed as collateral, all because of her, because he'd slapped the wrong woman, underestimated her skin, her suit, her silence. His phone stayed dark, no texts, no calls. The silence a weight he couldn't lift. He paced the room, the walls shrinking around him, the brick's message sinking in, the effigy's flames searing his pride. He'd survived the mob, kept his ground, but this was different, deeper. A legal blade slicing into his life. Aisha wasn't just digging. She was excavating, dragging every shortcut, every fist, every lie into the open. He grabbed the beer can, crushed it in his fist, the metal crumpling as he snarled, "She's got nothing." But the lie tasted bitter, and he knew she had everything, a decade of dirt he couldn't bury again. The protesters' chants echoed. In his head, a city he'd ruled now a furnace of rage, and he realized he was alone, cornered with her shadow stretching closer, deadlier than he'd ever feared. What's your take on this spiral? Comment number 1 if you think Marcus's past should have stayed buried, or if you're all in for Aisha peeling back his lies. Hit like if her quiet powers got you hooked on this reckoning, and subscribe to catch every brutal turn as this cop's world burns down. Can Marcus bribe his way out of this raid, Or is Aisha's next strike already locked and loaded? Stay tuned to see how deep this rabbit hole gets. Marcus Brandt slumped against the wall of his Carverton Heights duplex, the dawn light seeping through the shattered window, glinting off the glass shards strewn across his carpet. The internal affairs raid still burned in his skull. The image of that 2018 report, Jamal Tate's busted face, a ghost unearthed by Dr. Aisha Coleman's probe, clawing at his nerves. His phone sat silent, his crew's betrayal a weight he couldn't shake. The effigy of him burning downtown looping on the TV, flames licking a dummy in his uniform. The brick with racist pig scrawled in red ink mocked him from the floor, the text, "Your past is next," a splinter he couldn't pull out. Suspension was bad, the raid worse, but he wasn't done. He'd find a way out, claw back control, bury this storm like he'd buried every complaint in his 10 years on the force. He just needed help, a lifeline from someone who'd still take his call. He grabbed his keys, slipped out the back, and drove through Carverton's waking streets, the gentrified enclave stirring with early joggers and delivery trucks. His truck rattled, the dented hood a souvenir from the mob's rocks, as he headed for the industrial sprawl on the city's edge, a maze of rust and concrete where deals got done. Kyle Dunn waited there, his ex-partner, a wiry guy with a switchblade. Grin, who'd laughed off Marcus's rough stops, helped bury that 2018 beating with a wink and a beer. They'd been tight, a duo who'd bent the rules together, and Marcus needed him now, needed someone who wouldn't flinch at the heat Aisha had turned on him. He dialed Kyle from a burner phone, the call crackling through. "Meet me at the warehouse off 5th, he rasped, voice rough with desperation. "I'm in deep, need cover cash now." Kyle's voice came back low and steady. "Midnight, I'll fix it." A promise that steadied Marcus's shaking hands, a spark of hope in the dark. He rolled into the warehouse lot at 11:55, the hulking shell of steel and brick looming under a starless sky, weeds choking the cracked pavement. Kyle stood by a sagging chain-link fence, eyes darting, a duffel slung over his shoulder. Marcus climbed out, boots crunching gravel, and clapped him on the back, relief flooding in. "You're a lifesaver, man. What's the plan?" Kyle's smile was tight, off, his jaw twitching as he muttered, "Just get in your truck, I'll handle it." He dropped the duffel at Marcus's feet, a thud too heavy, too wrong, and before Marcus could ask, Kyle melted into the shadows, gone. Marcus frowned, unease prickling, and unzipped the bag. Bricks of white powder stared back. Cocaine enough to lock him up for life, and his gut dropped, a cold sweat breaking across his brow. This wasn't help. This was a setup. The sky erupted in red and blue, feds swarming from nowhere, tires screeching, agents in vests yanking him from the cab before he could bolt. Cuffs snapped tight, tighter than he'd ever snapped them, cutting into his wrists. As they shoved him to the ground, gravel biting his knees. "Daniel Brandt, you're under arrest for drug trafficking," a fed barked, voice clipped as cameras flashed, a live feed beaming his humiliation to every screen in Carverton. "It's not mine," he thrashed, yelling, his voice raw with panic. "It's a frame. Kyle set me up." But they didn't listen, didn't care, hauling him into a van, the doors slamming shut as the feed rolled, 2 million viewers watching. The ex-cop caught dirty, a headline too perfect to question. Hours later, he sat in a precinct cell, the concrete cold against his back, the stink of bleach and sweat choking him. The door clanged open, and there she was, Dr. Aisha Coleman, stepping in like she owned the place, her suit impeccable, her dark eyes carrying the weight of that slap he'd landed on her cheek days ago. She leaned close, her voice a whisper, threading through the chaos. "Confess your crimes, Marcus, or this gets worse." Her calm was a blade at his throat, her presence peeling back his defiance, but he sneered, clinging to the shred of pride he had left. "You've got nothing." "This is bullshit." She just nodded, stepping back, leaving him with a chill he couldn't name, her silence a promise he couldn't dodge. Morning came, and a slick lawyer in a cheap suit sprang him on bail, a technicality about the warrant's timing, a crack Marcus seized with a smirk creeping back. He walked out, sunlight stinging his eyes, strutting to his truck, free for a moment, gloating inside. Kyle's stunt had flopped, the drugs hadn't stuck, and Aisha's deal was a bluff. He'd turn this around, vanish if he had to, start over where her reach couldn't touch him. The precinct faded behind him. the city's pulse a distant hum, and he stopped at a gas station, fueling up, his chest loosening with every pump of the nozzle. He'd slipped her grip, beaten the frame up, outsmarted the chief who'd thought she could break him. That slap, that split-second act was losing its bite, or so he believed, leaning against the truck, the gasoline's sharp scent grounding him. His phone buzzed, a news alert jolting him upright, and he tapped it, expecting more protest noise, the same tired chants of justice for Aisha, but the screen froze his breath. Kyle Dunn's face staring back, pale, lifeless, a grainy shot from a ditch off Route 12. "Officer found dead," the headline blared. "Suicide note blames Brandt." His hands shook, the words searing into him. A note claiming Marcus had forced Kyle into corruption, threatened his life, pushed him to plant the drugs and end it all. A lie so neat it fit the Fed's story like a glove, pinning him not just for trafficking but for blood. The phone slipped, clattering onto the asphalt, and he stood there, pump nozzle dripping, the world spinning. This wasn't suicide. This was murder staged. A counterpunch so vicious it crushed his fleeting win, leaving him framed twice over. He snatched the phone, scrolling fast, the news anchor's voice clipping through. Anonymous sources confirm. Dunn's note names Marcus Brandt as the mastermind. Protesters swelled again, their signs sharper now. "Murderer Brandt must fall." His gut twisted, a hot flush crawling up his neck, because Kyle hadn't cracked, hadn't turned Judas on his own. This was her Aisha, her promise ringing true. This gets worse, her money or her power flipping the script, turning his one ally into a ghost. He'd walked out on bail, smirked at her whisper, thought he'd won, but she'd been steps ahead, orchestrating this, her reach a noose he couldn't slip. The gas pump clicked off, gasoline pooling under his boots, and he realized he'd never been free, not for a second, just a pawn in her game, her justice a tide he couldn't outrun. He jumped into the truck, engine roaring, tearing out of the station. The city blurring past as his mind raced. He was a fugitive now, wanted for drugs, for murder, all sparked by that one moment, that slap against her dark skin he'd thought would bend her, break her. But it was breaking him, piece by jagged piece. He floored it past Carverton's limits, headlights slicing the dark, knuckles white on the wheel because he couldn't stay, couldn't face her next move in a city she'd turned against him. The news looped in his head, Kyle's dead eyes, the note's lies, the camera's flash, and he knew she'd orchestrated it all. Her suit pristine, her silence a weapon sharper than any shout. He'd thought he could wait it out, thought the storm would pass, but it wasn't passing, it was growing. Fueled by her, by the chief he'd underestimated, and whatever came next would hit harder, deadlier, a trap he couldn't see but couldn't escape. Marcus Brandt gripped the steering wheel of his rusted truck, the engine coughing as he tore past Carverton's city limits, the skyline fading into a smudge of sodium light in his rear view. The gas station's news alert still seared his vision. Kyle Dunn's lifeless face, that staged suicide note pinning him for murder and drugs, a frame-up so tight it squeezed the air from his lungs. His brief taste of freedom after bailing out on the trafficking charge had soured into a nightmare. Dr. Aisha Coleman's whisper, "This gets worse," ringing true with every mile he put between him and the city she'd turned against him. That slap he'd landed on her cheek, the one that had sparked this firestorm, haunted him now. A split-second act against a black woman he'd thought he could break, but it was breaking him, piece by jagged piece. He was a fugitive, hunted by feds, branded a killer, all because he'd underestimated her, the chief of police he'd pegged as a nobody. He drove 2 hours, knuckles white, the highway stretching into a potholed ribbon of asphalt, flanked by dense pines, his mind a frantic blur. Carverton wasn't safe, not with Aisha's reach clawing after him, not with her power turning allies into ghosts and lies into handcuffs. He needed to vanish, needed a new name, a new life, something to dodge the noose she'd tightened around his neck. He pulled off Route 7, tires crunching gravel, and rolled into a rundown motel, its neon vacancy sign buzzing over a sagging roof. The lot was empty, shadows pooling under flickering lamps, a dive where cash still talked and questions stayed unasked. He parked in the dark, grabbed a wad of bills from his glove box and stumbled into the office, the air thick with stale smoke and mildew. A grizzled clerk, face creased like old leather, barely glanced up, sliding him a key for $20. Room 6, the guy grunted. No ID, no hassle, just what Marcus needed to disappear. The room stank of damp carpet and regret, a single bulb flickering over a lumpy bed, the walls stained yellow from years of neglect. He locked the door, slumping. Against it, chest heaving as the adrenaline bled out. He'd made it, slipped off the grid, free to think, to plan. He dialed a number from memory, a shady ex-cop named Ray he'd met years back, a guy who forged IDs, moved people, bent laws for cash. Ray picked up, voice gravelly. New name, new life, $5,000. Meet me in 2 days. Marcus seized it, a smirk tugging his lips as he sank onto the bed, the springs groaning under his weight. He'd outsmarted her, beaten her probe, her frame-up, her city. The viral clip, the chance, the brick through his window, they'd fade into echoes he'd leave behind. Exhaustion pulled at him, but not enough to dull the smug spark inside. He'd turned the tide, or so he believed. He flipped on the motels. Ancient TV, volume low, the screen crackling to life with news of Carverton's chaos. Protests swelled, news vans clogging streets, his face plastered on every billboard. Murder suspect Brandt on the run, the headline a brand he couldn't scrub. He clicked it off, grin widening, because they'd never find him here. Not in this nowhere hole, not with Ray's help. He leaned back, eyes drifting shut, certain he'd won this round until a creak snapped him awake, the clerk's voice muttering outside, too close, too sharp. He crept to the window, peering through grimy blinds, and saw the guy pacing, phone pressed to his ear, glancing at Marcus's truck. His stomach knotted, a prickle of wrongness he couldn't shake, and then the clerk's words cut through the glass. Yeah, it's him. Room 6. Recognition hit like a fist, the clerk's face sharpening in the dim light. A black man, late 30s, a scar above his brow. Someone Marcus had roughed up years ago. A traffic stop turned ugly. A night in 2016 when he'd slammed the guy against. His car cuffed him for resisting, laughed it off as the guy bled on the pavement. This wasn't random, this was memory, revenge in every syllable, turning his hideout into a trap. Headlights flared, engines growled, and the lot exploded with SWAT, black vans screeching in, boots pounding dirt, rifles glinting as they surrounded the motel. A megaphone blared, Marcus Brandt, come out, hands up. His heart slammed, panic, flooding him because he'd been so close, so sure. But Aisha's shadow stretched even here, her justice hunting him through the very people he'd crushed. He grabbed his keys, snatched a chair and smashed the back window, glass shattering as he dove out, bullets ripping through the door, a hot sting grazing his arm, blood soaking his sleeve. Pain seared, but he ran, stumbling into the woods behind. Branches clawing his face, breath ragged as flashlight beams swept the dark, their shouts fading into a dull roar. He'd escaped, barely, chest burning, arm throbbing, the motel a shrinking speck through the trees. He staggered deeper, pine needles crunching under his boots, thinking he'd made it. Slipped her grip again when headlights pierced the gloom ahead, a pickup rumbling to a stop. 3 figures climbed out, leather jackets, shaved heads, eyes, glinting in the night, and Marcus froze, his gut twisting. He knew them, a white supremacist gang he'd tipped off to raids years back, let slide on petty busts, a favor banked for a day like this. The leader, a barrel-chested guy with a swastika, tattoo curling up his neck, stepped forward, a grin splitting his face. Brandt, you look like hell, feds after you. Marcus forced a nod, panting, blood dripping from his arm. Yeah, they're framing me. That black chief's behind it. Need cover. Cash. Now. The guy clapped him on the shoulder, too hard, his grip lingering. We've got you, cop. Come with us. Relief flooded Marcus, a shaky grin tugging his lips as he followed them to the truck, climbing in, the leather cold against his skin. He'd found allies, muscle to match Aisha's reach, guys who'd see a white cop hunted by her kind as a brother, not a liability. The engine roared, the woods blurring past, and he leaned back, thinking he'd turned the night around. Dodged, her noose with the only crew left who'd take his side. He spilled it all, his voice rough with hate. She's framing me for drugs, murder, everything. That bitch Coleman's tearing it all down. The leader nodded, slow, deliberate. His grin thin, and Marcus exhaled. Good, they got it, they'd protect him. He'd slipped her net, found a lifeline in the dark, or so he believed. The truck rumbling deeper into the pines, the motel's chaos fading behind him. Aisha's face flashed in his mind, that slap, the spark that lit this inferno, but he shoved it down, certain he'd won this round, certain these guys would shield him from her wrath. The woods closed in, a cocoon of shadow, and he let his guard drop, exhaustion pulling at his bones, unaware that the trap he'd escaped was just the first, and the one ahead was sharper, deadlier. Waiting in the dark, he thought he'd claimed. What's your read on this twist? Comment number 1 if you think Marcus deserves this relentless chase for what he's done, or if you reckon he's just a pawn in a game too big to win. Hit like if Aisha's long reach has you glued to this unraveling, and subscribe to catch every brutal step as this fugitive's luck runs dry. Can these new allies pull Marcus out of the fire, or is Aisha's shadow about to turn his last hope into his worst nightmare? Keep watching to see what's lurking in those woods. Marcus Brandt slumped in the back of the pickup, the leather seat cold against his blood-soaked sleeve, the sting of the SWAT bullet grazing his arm, a dull fire under his skin. The truck rumbled through the dense pines off Route 7, the woods swallowing the motel's chaos, the red and blue strobes fading into memory. His chest heaved, breath ragged from the sprint that had barely saved him. The clerk's scarred face, a ghost from a 2016 stop turned traitor, still burning in his mind. The white supremacist gang, 3 leather-jacketed figures with shaved heads and glinting eyes, had snatched him from the jaws of Aisha's trap, a lifeline he'd banked on years ago when he'd tipped them off to raids, let their petty busts slide. The leader, a barrel-chested brute with a swastika tattoo curling up his neck, drove in silence, his thin grin a flicker in the dashboard glow. Marcus exhaled, relief washing over him. He'd found allies, muscle to match Dr. Aisha Coleman's reach, guys who'd shield him from the chief he'd slapped, the black woman who'd turned Carverton against him. The truck lurched to a stop. An hour later, the old mill looming ahead. A hulking skeleton of brick and steel, its smashed windows gaping like empty sockets, weeds choking the lot. Marcus climbed out, arm throbbing, forcing a grin as he followed them inside. The cavernous guts swallowing him whole, a maze of rust and damp concrete lit by a single lantern flickering on a table. They sat him down, the chair creaking under, his 6'2" frame, and the leader slid a beer across, the can sweating in the humid air. Marcus didn't touch it, his gut whispering something off, but he shoved it down, needing their guns, their cash, their hate to match his own. "Feds are framing me," he rasped, voice rough with exhaustion, blood crusting his sleeve. "That Black Chief Coleman, she's behind it all. Drugs, murder, the works. I just need a way out." The leader nodded, slow and deliberate, his grin sharpening as he leaned back, arms crossed over his barrel chest. "We've seen the news, cop. You're a lightning rod, but we'll protect you." The words eased Marcus's pulse, a vow that steadied his shaking hands, and he leaned back, thinking he'd found real allies, not like Kyle, not like the precinct rats who'd bailed. "Good," he said, exhaling hard, the tension bleeding out of his shoulders. "I knew you'd get it. She's tearing everything down, that bitch." He pictured Aisha's face, that slap, the spark that lit this inferno, her icy stare cutting through him on that downtown street. For a moment, he believed he'd won, believed he'd turned the tide with these guys, their shared venom a shield against her justice. The lantern's glow danced across their faces, the 2 others cracking knuckles, their silence a weight. Marcus. Didn't Clark not yet? He spilled more, his hate bubbling up. "She's got the feds, the city, everyone, framed me for Kyle's death, planted drugs. I need your help to vanish." The leader's grin widened, too wide, his eyes glinting with something Marcus couldn't place, and he said, "Yeah, we get it. But she paid better." The words sank in slow, a cold blade twisting in Marcus's gut, because no, that couldn't be right. Not them. Not these guys. He lunged forward, chair scraping, but the leader's fist slammed into his jaw, stars exploding, blood flooding his mouth as the others dragged him to the floor, boots crashing into his ribs, his gut, a storm of pain he couldn't fight. They hauled him up, pinning his arms. The the leader pulling out a phone, thumbing it on, a live stream flickering to life, the screen glowing with thousands of eyes already watching. "Time to teach cops a lesson. Live for the world," he snarled, and Marcus thrashed, yelling, "You bastards!" But their laughter roared over the phone's tinny speaker. "This is for screwing us, pig." The blows came again. A fist, pulping his nose, a knee cracking his ribs, bones splintering under leather as he curled, gasping, blood pooling on the concrete. He realized too late Aisha hadn't just found him. She'd bought him, turned his own hate against him, her money flipping the script, making him the punching bag for a cause he'd fed. The stream rolled, views hitting 5 million. Comments, scrolling, "Beat him down." "Justice now." His humiliation became a spectacle, his body a rag doll as they pounded him, skin splitting, teeth loosening, until he was a heap, barely conscious, thinking this was it, her final blow. But they stopped, the leader spitting on his crumpled form, the others tossing him out the back like trash, a heap in the dirt, alive, barely. He coughed blood, ribs screaming, crawling through the mud, staggering into the night as the woods gave way to a street, a cluster of shotgun houses flickering with porch lights in a black neighborhood he knew too well. He'd ruled these blocks once, stopped cars, searched kids, left bruises he'd laughed off, a cop with a badge and a fist keeping his order. Now he stumbled forward, blood dripping, thinking he'd hide, recover when faces appeared, residents stepping out, eyes narrowing, recognizing him. "That's Brandt, the cop from the video," a woman hissed, phone up, her voice sharp with a fury he'd never faced. Others joined, men, women, teens, a crowd forming, their anger a wave he couldn't swim against. He raised his hands, voice cracking, "Back off, I'm hurt." But the plea fell flat, drowned by a man's growl, "You broke my cousin's arm in 15, and a woman's shout, "My nephew's still got scars from you." Their words were a chorus of pain he'd sown, nights he'd flexed his power because they didn't belong in his Carverton, because their skin marked them as targets. A fist slammed into his gut, doubling him over, a kick dropping him to the pavement, and he curled, gasping, blood pooling under him as cameras rolled, lights flashing, a storm of blows raining down. He'd thought he'd slipped Aisha's grip, found a shield in the gang, but she'd turned them against him, handed him to the very people he'd terrorized, her justice a mirror reflecting every sin he'd buried. He choked on blood, vision, blurring, the crowd a wall of rage he couldn't breach, their phones capturing every groan, every plea. He'd laughed at their pain once, smirked as he'd cuffed them, but now they towered over him, a kingdom of vengeance he'd built with. Every swing of his baton, all sparked by that slap, that one moment he'd misjudged her. The mill's beating had left him broken, but this was worse, a reckoning he couldn't outrun. Their fists and feet a rhythm of retribution he'd never imagined. He curled tighter, thinking they'd tire, that he'd survive, but the crowd swelled, their rage a furnace fed by years of his cruelty. And he realized Aisha's trap wasn't just the gang. It was this, her power stretching beyond the woods, beyond the city into the streets he'd once ruled, deadlier with every blow. He gasped, blood bubbling in his throat, the world spinning as the mob pressed closer, their shouts a roar he couldn't mute. He'd thought he'd won, thought the gang was his ticket out, but Aisha had played him, turned his hate into a noose, handed him to his victims with a precision that chilled his bones. The slap echoed in his skull, her icy stare, her whisper, "You'll regret this." A promise she'd kept step by ruthless step. He'd underestimated her, dismissed her as a black woman he could silence, but she was silencing him. Her justice, a tide he couldn't stem. The crowd's blows slowed, his body a sack of pain, and he lay there alive barely, knowing this wasn't the end, just a pivot, a new trap snapping shut in the dark he couldn't escape. Marcus Brandt lay crumpled on the cracked pavement of a Carverton street, blood pooling beneath him, the metallic taste flooding his mouth as the mob closed in, a ring of bodies he couldn't escape. The white supremacist gangs beating at the mill still throbbed in his bones, ribs cracked, jaw swollen, but this was worse. A storm of fists and feet raining down from residents of a black neighborhood he'd once terrorized. Their faces loomed, eyes blazing with a fury he'd never faced. Phones flashing, filming every groan as he curled tighter, gasping for air. He'd stumbled here from the woods, dumped by the gang Aisha had turned against him, thinking he'd hide, recover. but they'd recognized him instantly. "That's Brandt, the cop from the video," a woman's voice slicing through the humid night air, sharp and unforgiving. The slap he'd landed on Dr. Aisha Coleman, Carverton's chief of police, echoed in his skull. That one moment he'd misjudged her, sparking this inferno, her justice a tide he couldn't stem. The crowd swelled. Men stepping from porches, women clutching brooms, teens with clenched fists. Their anger a wave he couldn't swim against. "You broke my son's arm in 15, a man growled, his fist slamming into Marcus's gut, doubling him over. "My cousin's still in jail 'cause of you," a woman shouted, her boot cracking his knee, dropping him flat. Their words were a litany of pain he'd sown. Nights he'd stopped their cars, searched their kids, left bruises he'd laughed off, all because they didn't belong in his Carverton, because their skin marked them as prey in his gentrified white enclave. A broom handle smashed across his back, splintering wood, and he screamed, a raw animal sound begging for mercy he'd never given. But the pleas fell flat, drowned by their rage, a furnace fed by years of his cruelty. He curled tighter, blood dripping from his split lip, vision blurring as fists pounded his ribs, a pipe clanging against his shin, bone grinding under the force. Cameras rolled, red dots blinking, a storm of lights capturing his humiliation. And he thought they'd tire, that he'd survive, his body a sack of pain but still breathing. He'd outlasted the gang, slipped the feds. He could outlast this. Or so he believed, choking on blood, the pavement cold against his cheek. The blows slowed, his gasps ragged, and he dared to hope, dared to think he'd hit bottom when headlights pierced the dark, tires squealing, a sleek black SUV rolling up, parting the crowd not in fear, but in awe, a hush falling over the street. Doctor. Aisha Coleman stepped out, her suit pristine midnight blue fabric catching the porch lights, her presence a thunderclap that stilled the air. Her cheek bore no mark from his slap days ago, healed now, but her eyes carried its weight, locking onto his with a calm so deep it sliced deeper than any fist. She didn't move to stop them, didn't call them off, just stood there watching. As they hovered, panting, their fists stained with his blood. Marcus writhed, choking on a sob, thinking she'd let them finish him, let the mob take what the gang hadn't, her silence louder than their shouts, a weapon sharper than their pipes. He'd thought he'd slipped her grip, found a lifeline in the woods, but she'd handed him to these people, the very ones he'd crushed, her justice a mirror reflecting every stop, every threat, every life he'd scarred. Sirens wailed, blew, lights flashing, and county deputies stormed in. Not her precinct grunts, but outsiders pulling the crowd back, yanking Marcus up, his body a limp heap of broken parts. He gasped, relief flooding as they dragged him from the pavement, blood dripping, bones screaming because he'd survived. They'd saved him, hauling him to an ambulance, straps tightening around his wrists, medics swarming with gauze and needles. He thought it was over, thought he'd hit the bottom at last, his chest heaving as the stretcher rolled through the chaos, the mob's shouts fading into a dull roar. Aisha stood still, her gaze unbroken, and he smirked, faint and shaky, because he'd lived, beaten her wrath, or so he believed. The morphine dulling the pain, the straps a cold comfort. But then she moved, stepping close as the stretcher passed, her heels clicking sharp against the asphalt, and slipped a phone into his limp hand, her voice low, a whisper cutting through the siren's howl. "Check the news." She stepped back, vanishing into the night, leaving him clutching it, screen lighting up as a medic patched his arm, blood soaking the gauze. Dread pooled in his gut, his fingers trembling as he tapped it, the news app flaring to life with her. Face again, live on air, her words a sledgehammer. Federal hate crime charges filed against Marcus Brandt, she announced, her tone steady, detailing assaults, frame-ups, a decade of targeting black and brown lives, her probe unearthing every sin he'd buried. His breath stopped, the world spinning, because this wasn't salvation. This was a handoff from mob justice to a legal ruin she'd orchestrated. The ambulance doors slammed, the siren howling, but all he heard was her whisper. All he saw was her face, knowing this wasn't the end, just a pivot, a new blade sharpening in the dark. He'd thought the deputies were his rescue, thought he'd slipped her noose, but she'd turned his win into a deeper fall, her trap snapping shut with a precision that chilled his bones. The phone slipped, clattering to the stretcher, the medic's hands a blur as the charges scrolled, each one a nail. 2015 assault. 2017 false arrest. A litany of hate he'd wielded because they didn't fit his Carverton, because their skin defied his order. He'd laughed then, smirked as he'd cuffed them, but now she'd flipped it, her justice a tide drowning him blow by blow, and he realized she hadn't just watched, she'd planned, her suit pristine, her silence a weapon he couldn't dodge. He sank back, blood crusting his lips, the stretcher rattling as the ambulance tore through Carverton streets, the mob's rage echoing in his skull, her eyes haunting his vision. That slap, that one moment he'd raised his hand, had sparked. This, her icy "you'll regret this," a promise she'd kept, step by ruthless step. He'd underestimated her, dismissed her as a black woman he could silence, but she was silencing him. Her power a web he couldn't break, handing him from fists to feds with a calm that crushed his pride. The medic's voice faded, the siren, a distant wail, and he knew the mob wasn't the worst, the gang wasn't the end. Aisha's next move was coming, sharper, deadlier, a trap he couldn't see but couldn't escape. Her justice a mirror he'd built with every sin, now reflecting. Back to bury him whole. What's your stance on this reckoning? Comment number 1 if you think Marcus's victims earned every swing they took, or if you reckon he's paid too high a price for one slap. Hit like if Aisha's calculated vengeance has you locked in for this ride, and subscribe to catch every twist as this cop's sins catch up fast. Can Marcus claw his way out of these federal charges, or is Aisha's courtroom hammer about to drop harder than the mob's fists? Stay with us to see how this chief turns his last gasp into her loudest victory. Marcus Brant shuffled into Carverton Federal Court, wrists cuffed, the steel biting his skin as deputies hauled him through a sea of cameras, reporters shouting, protesters jamming the stone steps with signs screaming, "Justice now!" and "Brant guilty." The hospital's antiseptic stink still clung to him, ribs taped, arm in a sling, the mob's beating a dull ache under morphine's haze, but the real pain was the phone Dr. Aisha Coleman had slipped him, its screen glowing with her voice announcing, "Federal hate crime charges, a decade of targeting black lives unearthed by her probe." That slap he'd landed on her cheek, the spark that lit this inferno, haunted him now, a split-second act against a black woman he'd thought he could crush. Not the chief of police who'd turned his world to ash. The courthouse loomed, a towering slab of grey stone and glass packed with bodies. Every seat filled, eyes boring into him as he sank into the defendant's chair, suit wrinkled, hair greasy, a shadow of the cop he'd been. The trial kicked off fast, a meteor storm swallowing Carverton, the air buzzing with tension that pressed against his skull. His lawyer, Hargrove, a slick weasel with a fake tan and a cheap tie, leaned close, breath hot with coffee. "Plead not guilty. We'll spin the slap as heat of the moment, self-defense. They've got no legs." Marcus nodded, a smirk creeping, back faint and shaky, because he'd talked his way out before, twisted truth into knots juries ate up. This was just a bigger stage, a game he could win. He stood, voice steady. "Not guilty." The words ringing out. A lifeline he gripped, tight, imagining the doubt he'd sow, the cracks he'd widen. That video, the slap cracking across Aisha's face, was bad, sure. But context was king, and he'd play the victim. The cop pushed too far. Not the monster they painted, not the racist they screamed he was. For a moment, he believed it. Believed. He'd flip this, walk free, maybe even sue for defamation. Turn Aisha's crusade into his comeback. The prosecution moved like a machine, their case a wall he couldn't climb, but he clung to Hargrove's spin, his smirk holding as the room hushed, every breath held when Aisha took the stand. Dr. Aisha Coleman, chief of police, stepped up, her suit a blade of midnight blue, her posture steel, her cheek healed, but her presence a wound he couldn't dodge. She swore in, her eyes locking onto his, not with hate, not with triumph, but with a cold, unyielding clarity that made his smirk die, a surgical precision that sliced through his bravado. This wasn't personal, this was methodical, and she was the scalpel. Her testimony carved him open, voice calm, precise, recounting the stop, his snarl, "You don't belong here." The slap, her silence, every detail a brick in a fortress he couldn't breach. Then the videos rolled. Not just the viral clip looping 5 million views, but a decade of footage Hargrove hadn't prepped him for. Precinct cams caught him slamming a black teen into a hood in 2016, his fist cracking the kid's nose, a smirk curling his lips as blood pooled. Dashcams showed him cuffing a sobbing Latina woman in 2018, her pleas ignored as he planted a baggie in her purse, chuckling to the radio static. Each frame was a nail, each word from Aisha a hammer. This wasn't one night. It was a pattern, a system he exploited. The witnesses followed, a parade he couldn't stop. The kid from 2020, jaw still crooked, voice trembling as he recounted. Marcus's baton breaking his arm, the shopkeeper from 2019, eyes hollow, detailing a frame-up that cost him his store. Their scars were his signature, a legacy he'd buried, now dragged into light by her team, her power, her will. He squirmed, sweat beading on his brow. The jury's faces hardening, eyes narrowing as the clips played, the voices echoed. "Do something," he hissed to Hargrove, his voice a rasp. But the lawyer just shrugged, pale, outmatched, his spin crumbling under the weight of proof. Aisha wasn't guessing, wasn't bluffing. She had stacks of it, complaints he'd silenced, reports he'd twisted, all unearthed by her probe, her reach stretching back to every night he'd flexed his badge because they didn't fit his Carverton, because their skin defied his order. Hargrove flailed, calling character witnesses who didn't show, cops who'd ghosted him, their silence a wall he couldn't breach, leaving Marcus's defense a hollow shell, a whisper against her roar. The prosecution rested, and the jury deliberated, a clock ticking in his skull, each second a weight he couldn't lift. He paced in his mind, clinging to one last hope. They'd see his side, the cop under pressure, not the villain she'd painted. It didn't take long hours, not days, and they filed back, faces stone, the foreman standing tall, guilty, assault, hate crimes. The words were a thunderclap, his chest caving, his smirk vanishing as the room spun, deputies shifting closer. He'd expected a fight, a chance, not this, not a rout, but he grasped at straws, sentencing, a light slap, probation maybe, a year tops, because he was a cop, ex-cop. They'd go easy, they always did. He forced a grin, glancing at the judge, a black woman, mid-50s, hair pulled tight, eyes sharp, a face he didn't know, didn't clock until she spoke. "Marcus Brandt," she said, her voice a gavel before it fell. "Your actions targeted a community, abused a badge. 25 years. The gavel cracked down, the number a sledgehammer, no parole, no mercy. And his vision swam, knees buckling as the courtroom erupted, cheers from the gallery, cameras flashing. 25 years. This wasn't light. This was a tomb. A sentence he'd never dreamed. A fall he'd never braced for. And he looked to Aisha, still on the stand, her nod subtle, final. A signal more was coming. The judge's eyes glinted, a detail clicking too late. She'd been mentored by Aisha, shaped by her, a web he'd missed, and the deputies grabbed his arms, dragging him out, his suit snagging, his world collapsing under a weight he couldn't lift. He stumbled, boots scuffing the marble floor, the crowd roaring, "Justice for Aisha!" A chant that drowned his gasps, his pride, his everything. The slap replayed in his skull, her icy, "You'll regret this." A promise she'd kept step by ruthless step, from the viral clip to the mob's fists, now to this, a courtroom hammer he couldn't dodge. He'd thought he'd spin it, walk, free, but she'd turned his game against him. Her probe a blade slicing through his lies, her witnesses a chorus he couldn't silence. He'd underestimated her, dismissed her as a black woman he could break, but she was breaking him, publicly. Undeniably, her power a tide he couldn't stem, her suit pristine, her silence a weapon he couldn't match. The deputies shoved him into a holding cell, the steel door clanging shut, the echo bouncing off the concrete walls as he sank to the bench, blood crusting his lips, ribs screaming with every breath. The trial spun in his head, the footage, the faces, the judge's voice. 25 years a chain he couldn't shake. He'd ruled Carverton's streets, bent its rules, laughed at its complaints. But now he was nothing, a convict in a wrinkled suit, his badge a memory, his freedom ash. Aisha's eyes haunted him, that calm, unyielding stare, and he realized too late she'd been building this since the slap, since he'd raised his hand, her justice a machine grinding him down, blow by blow, witness by witness, year by year. He'd thought he'd survive, thought he'd win, but she'd flipped it all. Her nod a signal this wasn't the end, just a pivot, a deeper trap snapping shut in the dark he couldn't escape. Marcus Brandt shuffled into Carverton State Prison, wrists cuffed, ankles shackled, the orange jumpsuit chafing his skin, a far cry from the uniform that had cloaked him in power for 10 years. The steel gates clanged shut behind him, a hollow boom echoing off the concrete tiers, his ribs still tender from the mob's beating, his arms scarred from the SWAT graze, the 25-year sentence, a chain he couldn't shake. Dr. Aisha Coleman's shadow loomed, her federal hate crime charges, her probe, her judge's gavel slamming down 25 years, no parole, all sparked by that slap he'd landed on her cheek, a split-second act against a black woman he'd thought he could crush. Not the chief of police who'd crushed him instead. He stepped onto the cell block, the air thick with sweat and menace, inmates' eyes tracking him. A dozen glares he didn't flinch from, because he'd been a cop, ruled Carverton's streets, and he knew this game, knew how to carry himself, chest out, jaw set, a predator, not prey. He smirked, faint and tight, expecting ex-cop respect, space, a nod from guards who'd worked the same beat. He'd spent a decade bending rules, breaking jaws, keeping order in his gentrified white enclave, and that badge still meant something here, a shield even in stripes, or so he believed. He strutted past the rows of cells, the catcalls starting low, a ripple he could handle. Fresh meat, pig in a pen. Voices he figured he'd silence with a glare, carve out a corner, ride this out like he'd ridden out every storm, since that slap. He dumped his thin mattress in a double cell, his bunkmate a wiry guy with a teardrop tattoo, silent, sizing him up through narrowed eyes. Marcus leaned back, arms crossed, the springs creaking under his weight. "I'm Brandt, ex-cop," he rasped, voice rough with a warning he'd used 1,000 times. "You don't mess with me, we're good." He expected a nod, a back-off, because that's how it worked, hierarchy, history, his past a wall they wouldn't breach. The bunkmate's lip curled, a sneer twisting his gaunt face, and he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Heard about you, pig, slapped the wrong lady." Marcus's smirk twitched, unease prickling his spine, because that wasn't respect, that was something darker, a spark he hadn't clocked. He brushed it off, figuring one guy didn't matter, he'd win the block, show them who he was. First day passed. Chow Hall quiet, yard tense, no moves, no trouble. Letting him think he'd settled in, taken control, his strut holding as he paced the concrete, eyes sharp, shoulders square. He'd ruled streets. He'd rule this, or so he believed. The slap's echo fading, Aisha's face a distant taunt he'd bury in time. Day 2 hit like a fist. He stepped into the rec room, a concrete box of benches and buzz, the air shifting. As heads turned, whispers cutting sharp, "That's him, the cop from the news." Before he could pivot, a fist crashed into his jaw, spinning him into a table, wood splintering under his weight. Another slammed his kidney, a third cracked his nose, blood gushing hot and thick, spilling down his chin. He swung back, wild, desperate, connecting once, twice, toppling a skinny guy with a shank scar. Adrenaline surging as he stood tall, panting, 3 down, thinking he'd won, proved his grit, earned his place. But the crowd parted, and a hulking inmate loomed, 6'5", tatted neck to knuckles, his eyes glinting with a hate Marcus knew too well. "You locked me up in 19, Brandt," he growled, voice a rumble that shook the room. "My sister's still paying for it." The blows came again, faster, harder, a storm he couldn't weather, boots stomping his ribs, fists pulping his face, bone cracking under the force. He curled, gasping, blood pooling on the concrete, the room a blur of orange and hate, because these weren't random. These were his arrests, his stops, his victims, black men, brown men, men he'd cuffed, beaten, framed, now free to repay every bruise, every lie. He realized the block wasn't his, it was theirs, a kingdom of vengeance he'd built with every swing of his baton, all sparked by that slap, by Aisha's face on every TV, her justice a beacon calling them to settle scores. Guards broke it. Up, batons swinging, dragging him to the infirmary, his body a map of pain, blood crusting his jumpsuit, the hulking inmate's glare a promise of more etched in his skull. He spat blood, snarling at the guard hauling him, a stocky black man with a buzz cut. "Get me protective custody now." His voice rasped, a demand he'd wielded 1,000 times, because ex-cops got that. It was protocol, a shield he'd earned. The guard leaned close, breath hot, his eyes narrowing with a recognition that sank Marcus's gut. "Remember Moss, 2017. You choked me at a stop, called it resisting." Memory flashed, a night he'd laughed off, another nobody he'd crushed, pinning the guy to his car, knee on his neck, smirking as he wheezed. This nobody smirked back now, a glint of triumph in his stare. "Coleman's reforms axed PC for dirty cops. You're Gen Pop, Brandt. Deal with it." He walked off, leaving Marcus on the cot, stitches pulling, fear clawing his chest because protective custody was gone, stripped by her, by Aisha, her oversight rewriting the rules, turning his last shield to dust. He lay there, breath shallow, the infirmary's sterile hum wrapping around him, the cot creaking under his battered frame, pain flaring with every shift. The attack replayed, the hulking inmate's fists, the guard's smirk, Aisha's shadow stretching even here, her justice a machine grinding him down, cell by cell, blow by blow. He'd survived the streets, the trial, the mob. He'd survive. Fierce claw his way back. Find a crack in her armor or so, he told himself, staring at the locked door, the guard's boots echoing beyond. Then the door swung open, a skinny inmate orderly with a mop slipping in to swap his bandages, and Marcus's eyes narrowed, spotting a bulge in the guy's pocket, a phone, contraband gold in a place like this. "Give me that," he rasped, voice low, a cop's command still sharp in his throat, and the orderly flinched, hesitating, but Marcus's glare, even bruised, held weight. The guy handed it over, a battered flip phone, scratched but alive, a lifeline Marcus hid under the pillow, pulse racing. This was it, his shot, a way to call out, fight back, turn this hell around. The orderly shuffled off, and Marcus flipped. They'd open, fingers trembling, dialing a number he'd memorized. A crooked lawyer named Kessler he'd used years back, a guy who'd bent laws for cash. Kessler picked up, voice oily. "Brandt, you're a mess. What's the play?" Marcus whispered. "Appeal, get me out. I've got dirt, cash stashed, whatever you need." Laying out a plan, the 2018 beating he could pin on someone else, the drug frame he could twist, a desperate bid to flip the guilty verdict, lighten the 25 years. Kessler chuckled, "Risky but doable. Record it, send it. I'll work it." A spark of hope ignited, and Marcus smirked, pain forgotten, because he'd beat Aisha yet, outsmart her reforms, her prison, her web. He recorded a shaky voicemail. "I'll give you the 2018 beating, not mine, Kyle's deal, I've got proof." A lie stitched with truth, sending it to Kessler's burner, thinking he'd turned the tide, picturing freedom, a new name, a new life. Her face fading from his nightmares. He sank back, the phone tucked away, exhaustion pulling at him, but victory close, tangible. A crack in her armor he'd widen, or so he believed. The infirmary's hum a lullaby to his battered pride, unaware that the next blow was coming, sharper, deadlier. Coiled in the dark, he thought he'd claimed. Marcus Brandt lay on the infirmary cot in Carverton State Prison, the sterile hum wrapping around him like a shroud, his battered frame sinking into the thin mattress, stitches tugging at his swollen face. The gang's ambush in the rec room still throbbed in his bones, ribs cracked, nose pulped, a shank's jagged edge a ghost in his side, blood crusting his orange jumpsuit. The guard's smirk, Coleman's reforms axed PC, echoed in his skull, leaving him exposed in Gen Pop, a death knell he couldn't shake. Dr. Aisha Coleman's shadow stretched everywhere, her 25-year sentence a chain he couldn't break, all sparked by that slap he'd landed on her cheek. A moment he'd thought would silence her, a black woman he'd pegged as nothing, not the chief of police who'd silenced him instead, step by ruthless step. But he wasn't done, not yet. The smuggled flip phone under his pillow a lifeline, his recorded confession to Kessler a spark of hope he'd fanned into a flame. He'd sent it hours ago, a shaky voicemail pinning the 2018 beating on a dead cop, twisting the drug frame into Kyle's deal, a lie stitched with just enough truth to lighten his sentence, flip the guilty verdict, get him out. Kessler's oily "I'll work it" rang in his ears, a promise he clung to, his smirk creeping back, faint and jagged. Because he'd beat her yet, outsmart her reforms, her prison, her web. The infirmary's dim light flickered, the cot creaking. As he shifted, pain flaring but dulled by the thrill of victory, a crack in her armor he'd widen. He pictured freedom, a new name, a new life, Aisha's face fading from his nightmares, her icy, "You'll regret this," a taunt he'd bury. He'd survived the mob, the trial, the shank. He'd survived this, turn this hell around, or so he believed, his breath steadying, the phone a secret he guarded with every shallow inhale. The door creaked, a guard stepping in, not the buzzcut. Traitor who'd denied him protection, but a new face blank and bored handing him a water cup, plastic crinkling in his grip. Marcus drank slow, the cool liquid soothing his raw throat, not noticing the faint click, the lines humming beyond the walls. Because he didn't know, couldn't know, Aisha's team had traced it, tapped it, her reach stretching into the infirmary's guts, intercepting every word, every lie. He sank back, the cup slipping to the floor, exhaustion pulling at him, victory close, tangible, until the TV above flickered on, a news break shattering the quiet, his voice crackling through. "I'll give you the 2018 beating, not mine. Kyle's deal. I've got proof." A bombshell twisting his appeal into a noose. He bolted upright, pain screaming through his ribs because this wasn't Kessler, this was her Aisha, her face filling the screen now, announcing, "National reform, the Brandt Act, accountability. Starts with him." Her tone steady, her suit pristine, her eyes locking onto his through the glass. His confession leaked global 5 million views in minutes, branding him not just a convict but a symbol. His family's name flashing in a statement. "We reject him." His sister's voice, his last tie, gone. He broke, the phone slipping. From his grip, cracking on the floor, sobs racking his frame as the scope widened. Brandt Act trending, inmates chanting his name beyond the walls, shanks sharpening in the dark. He'd confessed scraps, thinking it'd save him, but she'd turned it, made it a monument. His infamy a legacy she'd carved, his 25 years a footnote to her triumph. He sank back, tears mixing with blood, the TV blaring her voice. "We will root out corruption." A vow he couldn't unhear because she wasn't stopping, wasn't slowing, and he'd underestimated her again, dismissed her as a black woman he could outmaneuver. But she was outmaneuvering him, piece by piece. The infirmary shrank around him, the chants growing louder, closer. "Brandt, Brandt!" A rhythm of rage he couldn't mute, and he realized she'd flipped his play, turned his lifeline into a trap, her justice a tide drowning him cell by cell. He'd thought he'd hit bottom, thought the shank was the worst, but this was deeper. Her power absolute, her nod on the screen, a signal more was coming, a blade he couldn't see but couldn't dodge. The door clanged open again and he flinched, expecting guards, medics. But a shadow loomed, a cop in uniform, young, broad, baton tapping his palm, stepping into the light. Marcus squinted, pain sparking as the guy's face sharpened. A black man, 30s, eyes blazing, a stranger until he snarled, 15 years ago you slapped my mum." The pieces crashed together. Aisha's son, a cop now, her blood, her fire, and Marcus's gut sank, because this wasn't random. This was her final play personal, a debt passed down. "I paid," he rasped, voice cracking. "I'm done." But the son's laugh was cold, bitter. "Not to me." And the baton swung, cracking his knee, dropping him to the cot, a fist smashing his jaw, blood flooding his mouth again. He curled, gasping, no fight left, just pain, just fear. As the sun rained blows, each one a thudding echo of that slap. That night her cheek had flared red, her eyes unyielding. The baton smashed his ribs, splintering bone, and he choked, "Why? I served it, why?" But the son stepped back, panting, leaving him a heap, blood pooling, breath fading. Marcus lay there, vision blurring, thinking he'd hit bottom now, that this was her last strike. Her son's fists, her hands, her will, a vengeance he couldn't outrun. He'd thought the confession was his win, thought he'd slipped her grip, but she'd turned it, handed him to her blood, her justice a mirror reflecting every sin he'd sown, deadlier with every blow. The infirmary spun, the son's footsteps fading, the TV looping Aisha's voice, her face, her law, and Marcus sobbed, blood bubbling in his throat because she'd planned this, waited, let him think he'd fought back, only to strike here, now, her son a blade she'd sharpened. He'd underestimated her, dismissed her. As a black woman he could silence, but she was silencing him. Her power a web he couldn't break, her suit pristine, her silence a weapon he couldn't match. The gang's shanks, the mob's fists, the fed's charges, they were prelude, this was personal, a reckoning he couldn't dodge, and he knew she wasn't done. Not yet. Her nod, a signal the next trap was coming, sharper, darker, coiled in. The shadows he thought he'd claimed. He lay there, shattered, breath shallow, the sun's blows a rhythm he couldn't outrun. Aisha's justice a tide drowning him blow by blow, year by year, a ruin he couldn't escape. Marcus Brandt limped out of Carverton State Prison's gates, the steel clanging shut behind him, a hollow echo swallowed by the dusk air 15 years into his 25-year sentence. His once broad frame had withered, grey hair thinning, scars crisscrossing his skin from shanks and fists, the gang's relentless ambushes a gauntlet he'd crawled through day by brutal day. Dr. Aisha Coleman's shadow had never faded, her Brandt Act a chain around his name, her leaked confession, a brand that turned every inmate against him, her sons beating in the infirmary a personal scar that throbbed with every step. That slap he'd landed on her cheek, the spark that lit this hell haunted him still. A moment he'd thought would break her. A black woman he'd dismissed as nothing, not the chief of police who'd broken him instead. Her justice a tide, drowning him slow, relentless, absolute. The parole board had stamped good behavior on his file, a hollow laugh because good behavior was cowering, taking it, living when he'd wanted to die, and they'd cut him loose early, unexpected, shoving him out with a bus ticket and a warning, "Don't come back." He blinked in the sun, 53 free or so he thought, shuffling into Carverton's sprawl, the air sharp with a freedom he didn't trust. His jumpsuit swapped for a thrift store jacket, a duffel slung over his shoulder. He kept his head. Down the city's pulse distant, unfamiliar, rebuilt in her image. Her reforms a wall he'd never breach. Aisha was still out there, still chief, her statues rising in parks, her legacy cemented while he was ash. A footnote to her triumph. He'd vanish, fade into some nowhere town, a shadow no one would chase, or so he planned, stepping off the bus. In a rundown district, the streets narrower, the buildings sagging under years of neglect. Dusk fell and he cut through an alley, a shortcut to a flop house, damp brick walls closing in, boots scuffing puddles, thinking he'd made it, slipped her grip at last, 15 years enough to dull her blade. A figure stepped from the dark, tall, broad, a cop's silhouette, baton tapping his palm, and Marcus froze, instinct flaring, his gut twisting because this wasn't random, not here, not now. The guy moved fast, slamming him against the wall, the brick biting his back, breath hot as he snarled, "You don't remember me, do you, Brandt?" Marcus squinted, pain sparking as the baton pressed his throat, the face sharpening. A black man, 30s, eyes blazing, the same glare he'd faced in the infirmary 15 years ago. 15 years back, you slapped my mom, ruined us. The guy growled, and the pieces crashed together. Aisha's son, now a lieutenant, her blood, her fire, a cop grown into her shadow. "I paid," Marcus rasped, voice cracking. "I'm done." But the son's laugh was cold, bitter. "Not to me." And the baton swung, cracking his knee, dropping him to the wet pavement, a fist smashing his jaw, blood flooding his mouth. Again. He curled, gasping, no fight left, just pain, just fear, as the sun rained blows, each one an echo of that slap. That night her cheek had flared red, her eyes unyielding. A fist pulped his nose, bone splintering, and he choked. "Why?" "I served it, why?" She emerged then, Aisha stepping from the alley's mouth, silver-haired now, her suit sharp midnight blue catching the streetlight's flicker, her presence a thunderclap that stilled the air. "Justice evolves, Marcus," she whispered. Voice, a blade cutting deeper than the baton, her calm a weight he couldn't lift. The sun's blows stopped short, Marcus gasping, alive, barely, blood pooling beneath him. And he thought it was over, thought he'd survived her last strike, her son's fists, her hands, her will, a vengeance he couldn't outrun. But then cops. Swarmed not her precinct grunts, but city badges, cuffing him tight, yanking him up, his body a sack of broken parts, and he squinted, confusion swirling through the pain, because this wasn't arrest. This was something else, something sharper. The son stepped back, panting, wiping blood from his knuckles, and Aisha's gaze held steady, no hate, no glee, just certainty as his vision dimmed, his heart slowing, the alley swallowing him. A cop barked, "Marcus Brandt, you're under arrest." And he rasped, "For what?" Blood bubbling in his throat, the answer a sledgehammer he didn't see coming. "Murder," the cop snapped. "Lieutenant Coleman's suicide, staged, pinned on you." The twist hit, Aisha's son, dead. A frame so neat it crushed his breath, her final play burying him forever. He choked, vision blurring, the cuffs biting as they dragged him to a van, the alley spinning, Aisha walking off, Carverton's hero, her silver hair glinting under the lamps. The son's suicide flashed in his mind, a lie she'd crafted, her blood a blade she'd sharpened to end him. Cops planting evidence he couldn't fight, a new murder rap locking him in a life sentence he couldn't dodge. He'd thought parole was freedom, thought 15 years had dulled her grip, but she'd waited, planned. Let him taste the sun only to strike now. Her justice a circle closed, her power absolute, unyielding. The van doors slammed, the engine roaring, but all he heard was her whisper. Justice evolves, all he saw was her face, knowing she'd orchestrated it all, the parole, the alley, the end, every step since that slap a thread in her web. Sank against the van's wall, blood dripping, bones screaming, the city blurring past as they hauled him back to a cage, a life term snapping shut where 25 had cracked open. That slap replayed, her icy, "You'll regret this," a promise she'd kept from the viral clip to the mob's fists, the feds' charges, the prison shanks. Now this, a staged death he couldn't disprove, her son a ghost she'd wielded to bury him whole. He'd underestimated her, dismissed her as a black woman he could silence, but she'd silenced him, her suit pristine, her silence a weapon he couldn't match, turning his hate to dust, his freedom to ash, her victory a flame burning beyond. His grave beyond his end, eternal. The van jolted, Carverton's streets fading, the flophouse a dream he'd never reach, and he realized she'd flipped his last gasp. Her son's suicide, a lie so tight it fit the law's story, like a glove, cops nodding as they drove, their eyes cold, her influence a web he couldn't break. He'd ruled Carverton once, bent its rules, laughed at its pain, but now he was nothing. A convict twice over, his name erased while she stood tall, statues rising, Easton hailing her a hero, his slap a footnote, a warning carved in her triumph. He slumped, blood crusting his lips, the van's hum a dirge because she'd waited. Let the years soften him, only to strike now, her justice evolving, deadlier, sharper, a reversal he'd never seen, never dreamed, until it took his life. Her whisper the last sound he heard, her face the last he saw, a chief who'd turned his world to ruin, absolute, forever. This story unravels a raw truth. Actions rooted in prejudice can ignite a firestorm of consequences that burn far beyond the moment. Marcus Brandt's slap against Dr. Aisha Coleman wasn't just a physical act, it was a symbol of systemic arrogance, a belief he could wield power unchecked because of her race. What he didn't see was her strength, her position as chief of police, and her unyielding resolve to dismantle his world. The lesson here is clear. Underestimating others based on bias is a fatal flaw, one that can unravel a life meticulously built on lies and brutality. Aisha's triumph teaches us that justice, though slow, is relentless when fueled by truth and resilience. Every step of Marcus's downfall, from the viral video to the prison shanks, the mob's fists to the final frame, reflects a mirror held up to his past, showing that no badge, no scheme, no hate can shield you from accountability forever. For every victim he silenced, a voice rose louder, proving that communities, when united, can topple even the most entrenched oppressors. This tale warns us to question our assumptions, to recognize the power in those we might dismiss, and to understand that real strength lies not in violence, but in the quiet, persistent pursuit of what's right. Marcus's collapse is a cautionary echo. Prejudice doesn't just harm its target. It boomerangs, destroying the wielder with a force they can't outrun. Aisha's victory stands as a beacon. Justice evolves, and those who sow hate reap ruin. What's your takeaway from Marcus's fall and Aisha's rise? Drop a comment with your thoughts on whether bias always backfires like this. Hit like if this tale struck a chord, subscribe for more gripping journeys, and share to spark a justice conversation. Thanks for joining this ride. May you walk away inspired to stand tall against wrong wherever it hides.